I read the intelligence report 3 times, because I was certain someone had made a translation error. I sat at my console in the diplomatic wing of the Galactic Council station, my hands trembling against the smooth surface of the display panel, and I read it again, 4 times. The words did not change. The Vraxian Dominion had formally announced a military campaign against Earth, against humanity, against the one species in this galaxy that every sane diplomat, every competent strategist, every half-awake intelligence officer knew you did not provoke. I wanted to laugh. I almost did. Then the weight of what was about to happen settled into my chest like a stone dropped into still water, and all I felt was dread. My name is Viral Thanos, and I have served as a senior diplomatic representative to the Galactic Governing Council for 23 standard years. In that time, I have witnessed 9 border disputes, 2 trade wars, and 1 attempted genocide. None of those events frightened me the way this single intelligence brief did. Not because the Vraxians were powerful, though they were. Not because war itself was unusual, though it was increasingly rare. But because I had been to Earth. I had walked its cities, studied its history, reviewed its classified military records through a diplomatic access channel that took me 6 years to obtain. I knew what the Vraxians were walking into, and I knew that by the time they realized their mistake, it would be far too late to walk back out. The emergency session was called within the hour. I took my seat in the grand gallery of the council chamber, a vast circular hall designed to hold representatives from over 400 recognized species. The seats curved upward in tiers, and at the center stood the speaker's podium, raised on a platform of polished stone that was older than most of the civilizations represented in the room. Today, the podium belonged to Commander Dorath, the Vraxian military envoy. He was tall for his species, broad across the shoulders, with the deep gray skin and sharp features that marked the Vraxian officer class. He stood with the rigid confidence of someone who had never been told he was wrong, and he spoke with the measured precision of someone who believed every word leaving his mouth was self-evident truth. The human world designated Earth, he said, his voice carrying easily through the chamber's acoustic design, represents an unaligned, resource-rich system with minimal defensive capability. Our strategic analysis confirms that their fleet presence beyond their home system is negligible. They maintain no significant colonial network. Their species' lifespan is among the shortest of any spacefaring race. Their industrial output, while notable, cannot sustain a prolonged military engagement against a force of our magnitude. He paused for effect. I watched his eyes sweep the gallery, looking for approval. He found it in some corners. The younger races, the ones who had never dealt with humans directly, were nodding along. The Kaleshi delegation was whispering among themselves with what looked like admiration for the boldness of the plan. The Drexy trade representative was already tapping notes into his console, probably calculating the economic opportunities that would follow a successful conquest. Even the Morvathi, a species I generally respected for their analytical rigor, seemed to accept Dorath's assessment without question. On paper, his argument made perfect sense. The numbers were accurate. The fleet comparisons were factually correct. Earth did look weak on paper. That was the problem with paper. It could not show you the things that mattered. It could not capture the look in a human soldier's eyes when someone threatened the people standing behind her. It could not measure the weight of a species that had spent its entire evolutionary history fighting everything on its planet, including itself, and surviving. Humans had always looked weak on paper. The Scythian had believed the paper. The Scythian no longer existed as a military power. The Vraxian Dominion will commit a primary assault fleet of 800 warships, Dorath continued. We anticipate complete strategic control within 14 standard days. Resistance is expected to be minimal. I closed my eyes. 14 days. He expected to conquer humanity in 14 days. The Scythian raiders had thought they could hit a human mining colony with 120 ships and be gone before anyone noticed. They had been technically correct about one thing. Someone did notice. Everyone noticed. Because the humans chased them across 2 star systems and dismantled their entire fleet over the course of 3 weeks. 94 ships lost. Their entire command structure erased. And when the Council had formally requested an explanation for the disproportionate response, the human admiral, a quiet woman named Grace Holloway, had submitted a 6-word official statement. They touched our people. We responded. I opened my eyes and pressed the signal on my console to request the floor. The council speaker, a Doraxi elder named Morath, acknowledged me with a slight inclination of his broad, flat head. Ambassador Thanos, you have the floor. I stood. Every eye in the chamber turned toward me, and I felt the familiar tightness in my throat that came whenever I knew I was about to say something no one wanted to hear. Speaker Morath, esteemed colleagues, I rise to invoke a formal advisory objection under Section 47 of the Galactic Accord. I urge this body to issue an immediate warning to the Vraxian Dominion regarding the proposed military action against the human homeworld. Jorath's expression shifted, just slightly, a flicker of something between amusement and contempt. On what grounds? Speaker Morath asked. On the grounds that this campaign will result in the complete and irreversible destruction of the Vraxian military, and potentially the destabilization of Vraxian civilization as a whole. Silence. Then, slowly, a murmur rolled through the gallery. Not the murmur of agreement, the murmur of discomfort. They did not want to hear this. They never did. Commander Doroth actually smiled. Ambassador Thanos, your concern is noted, but I must ask, are you seriously suggesting that a single species, confined to one system, with a registered fleet of fewer than 300 vessels, poses a meaningful threat to 800 Vraxian warships? I am not suggesting it, I said. I am stating it with absolute certainty. The murmur turned into scattered laughter. Not from the senior diplomats, not from the races who had been around long enough to know better, but from the younger delegations, the ones who measured strength by counting ships and comparing tonnage. They did not understand. They had never read the files. Speaker Morath gave me a long look, and I saw something in his ancient eyes that I recognized. He knew. The Doraxi had been part of the Council for over 1,000 years. They had archives that went back further than most species' recorded history. Morath knew exactly what humanity was capable of, but the Council operated on consensus, and consensus required evidence, and the evidence I needed to present was locked behind classification levels that would take months to unseal. Your objection is recorded, Morath said quietly. The Council will take it under advisement. Under advisement. The diplomatic equivalent of a shrug. I sat down and felt the weight of helplessness settle over me like a second skin. Around me, the session continued as though my warning had been nothing more than a brief procedural interruption. Dorath resumed his briefing, outlining supply chain logistics and expected timelines for what he called planetary pacification. He used the word as though it were an ordinary administrative term, as though he were discussing the reorganization of a filing system rather than the subjugation of a species that had clawed its way to the stars through sheer, stubborn refusal to accept defeat. I looked around the gallery at my colleagues, searching for any sign that someone shared my alarm. The Doraxi delegation sat in stoic silence. The Veshon ambassador was reviewing his notes. The Torelli representative had closed her eyes entirely. None of them would speak. None of them would risk diplomatic capital on a warning about a species that most of them barely understood. And so the session ended, and the Vraxian campaign was officially noted in the Council record, and the galaxy moved one step closer to the greatest miscalculation in modern history. After the session, I went straight to my private office and opened a secure communication channel to the human embassy on the Council station. The connection took longer than usual, and when the screen finally resolved, I found myself looking at Commander Lena Voss, the human diplomatic liaison. She was a woman in her middle years, with short dark hair and the kind of steady, unreadable expression that humans seem to cultivate the way other species cultivated defensive coloring. Ambassador Thanos, she said, I expected your call. Commander Voss, I need to inform you that the Vraxian Dominion has formally declared a military campaign against Earth. I attempted to raise an objection in the Council session, but it was not taken seriously. I believe you are in extreme danger, and I strongly recommend that your government begin immediate preparations for defense. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she did something that made my blood run cold. She smiled. Not a wide smile, not a happy smile, just a small, quiet curve at the corners of her mouth, the kind of expression a seasoned card player makes when someone at the table has just bet everything on a losing hand. We know, she said. I blinked. You know? We have known for 11 days, Ambassador. Our intelligence services intercepted the Vraxian planning communications before they were finalized. We appreciate your concern. Truly, we do. You are one of the few voices on that council who has ever spoken in our defense, and we will not forget that. 11 days. They had known for 11 days, and they had done nothing. No emergency petition to the council, no public statement, no visible mobilization, nothing. Commander Voss, I said slowly, if you have known for 11 days, why has there been no response? No diplomatic protest? No request for council intervention? She tilted her head slightly, the way humans do when they are considering how much truth to share. Because we do not need the council's intervention, Ambassador. And to be perfectly frank with you, a diplomatic protest would require us to reveal the extent of our intelligence capabilities, which we prefer not to do. The Vraxians have made their decision. We have made ours. And what decision is that? Another small smile. You might want to consider taking a long vacation, Ambassador. Somewhere far from Vraxian space. Somewhere quiet. The screen went dark. I sat in the silence of my office for a very long time. Then I opened my personal log, a private recording I had maintained for years as a kind of insurance policy against the day when someone would need to understand how a catastrophe had been allowed to happen. This is Ambassador Virel Thanis, I said to the empty room. Personal log, date mark 7439. The Vraxian Dominion has declared war on humanity. The Council has declined to intervene. The humans have known about the attack for 11 days and have chosen not to respond publicly. I am recording this for whoever finds it useful afterward, because I no longer believe that reason will prevail. The Vraxians do not understand what they have done. They see a small species on a small world, and they see opportunity. They do not see what I have seen. They have not read the files I have read, and by the time they learn the truth, the learning will come at a cost that no civilization should ever have to pay. I paused the recording and stared at the dark screen where Commander Voss's face had been moments ago. 11 days. They had known for 11 days and had not even raised their voice. That was the part that terrified me more than anything else. I could not sleep that night. I lay in the dim light of my quarters on the council station, staring at the ceiling, running the numbers over and over in my head. 800 Vraxian warships against whatever humanity had hidden behind that calm, unreadable silence. It was not the kind of calculation that produced comfortable answers. So I did what I always do when the present terrifies me. I went looking for context in the past. I got out of bed, crossed to my workstation, and opened every file I had ever collected on humanity's military history. Some of these were official council records, sanitized and redacted to the point of being almost useless. Some were intelligence briefs I had obtained through diplomatic channels that were not entirely official. And some, a small handful that I kept on an encrypted personal drive, were documents I should not have had at all. Reports that had been classified above my clearance level, buried in archives that most council members did not even know existed. I opened my personal log and began to narrate. Not because anyone was listening, but because the act of speaking the words aloud made them feel more real, more urgent, more impossible to ignore. The fundamental mistake that every species makes when evaluating humanity, I said, speaking slowly and choosing my words with care, is that they measure humans by the same standards they use to measure everyone else. Fleet size, system count, population, lifespan. By every conventional metric, humans are unremarkable. They are a single system species with a small navy, a short biological lifespan, and no meaningful territorial presence beyond their own solar system. On paper, they look exactly like what Commander Dorath described in the council chamber. A soft target, an easy campaign. I pulled up the first file, a comparative analysis of fleet doctrine across the 30 largest military powers in the galaxy. Humanity was listed at number 27. Their registered fleet numbered 280 vessels, which put them below the Phelan Consortium, below the Scythian Remnant, below species that most galactic citizens could not even name. It was an absurd ranking, and anyone who had bothered to look deeper than the surface would have known it. The reason humans appear weak, I continued, is that they do not count the way other species count. When the Vraxians report their fleet strength, they include every warship, support vessel, and patrol craft in active service. When the Diraxi report, they include their reserve fleets and orbital defense platforms. Every species in this galaxy reports its military strength in a way that is designed to look as impressive as possible. Humans do the opposite. Their official fleet registry includes only what they call their active-duty navy. It does not include their reserve fleet, which is maintained at a state of near-immediate readiness. It does not include their system defense forces, which operate independently of the Central Navy. And it does not include what humans refer to as the civilian auxiliary. I paused on that phrase. The civilian auxiliary. It sounded harmless, almost bureaucratic, the kind of term that belonged in a trade agreement rather than a military briefing. But I had seen the actual figures, buried in a footnote of a trade audit that I had once reviewed as part of a routine economic assessment. The civilian auxiliary consisted of armed merchant vessels, mining ships with retrofitted weapons systems, private security contractors, and independent captains who held standing contracts with the human government. In the event of a general mobilization, these vessels were legally required to respond. Their combined number was roughly 3 times the size of the official navy. The true size of humanity's available military force, I said, is not 280 ships. By my best estimate, accounting for reserves, system defense forces, and civilian auxiliary vessels, the actual number is somewhere between 900 and 1,200 combat-capable ships, and that estimate may be conservative, because humans have a documented tendency to build things in secret and not tell anyone about them until those things are needed. I closed the fleet analysis and opened the next file. This one was not a spreadsheet or a strategic assessment. It was an after-action report, classified at the highest level the Council's intelligence division maintained, and it described what had happened 6 years ago when the Scythian harvesters had raided a human mining colony on the outer edge of their controlled space. The Scythian incident, I said, and even speaking the words aloud, I felt the cold weight of what they meant settle into my bones. The colony was called Prospect 7. It was a mining operation on an asteroid in a system that the humans had claimed, but never heavily developed. The permanent population was around 6,000, mostly miners, engineers, and their families. The garrison consisted of 4 frigates, small, fast, and lightly armed by any reasonable standard. The Scythian raiding fleet numbered 120 warships, a force that should have overwhelmed the colony's defenses in a matter of minutes. The Scythian arrived at Prospect 7 expecting no meaningful resistance, I narrated. What they encountered instead were 4 human frigate captains who had apparently decided, independently and without waiting for orders from their central command, that they were not going to let a single Scythian ship reach the colony. The engagement lasted 9 hours. 9 hours, 4 frigates against 120 warships, and the humans held for 9 hours. They lost 2 of the 4 ships. The crews of those ships did not survive, but the remaining 2 frigates, damaged and running low on ammunition, managed to hold the Scythian fleet in a contested zone long enough for a response fleet to arrive from Earth. The response fleet consisted of approximately 60 vessels, I said. They arrived at Prospect 7, engaged the Scythian fleet, and drove them out of the system within 2 hours. But they did not stop there. They pursued. This was the part that every xenostrategist I had ever spoken to found the most difficult to comprehend. In standard galactic military doctrine, once an enemy retreats from your territory, the engagement is over. You secure your borders, assess your losses, and open diplomatic channels for a ceasefire. This is how every species in the galaxy conducts warfare, because the cost of pursuing a retreating fleet across interstellar distances is enormous, and the strategic benefit is usually minimal. Humans do not follow standard galactic military doctrine. The human response fleet pursued the retreating Scythian across 2 star systems over a period of 3 weeks, I said. During that time, they engaged and destroyed Scythian vessels wherever they found them. They did not accept surrender offers. They did not negotiate. They tracked the Scythian command ships to a staging area in the Karath Nebula and engaged them in a final battle that lasted 11 hours. When it was over, the Scythian had lost 94 of their original 120 ships. Their entire command structure, including 3 fleet admirals and the operational planning staff, was gone. I let that number sit in the air for a moment. 94 ships. The Scythian had attacked a mining colony and lost nearly their entire fleet. And when the Galactic Council had formally requested an explanation for what it called a disproportionate military response, Admiral Grace Holloway had submitted her 6-word statement, and the matter had been quietly dropped. The reason I am recounting this incident in detail, I said, is not because it demonstrates human military capability, although it does. It is because it demonstrates human military philosophy. Every other species in this galaxy fights to achieve strategic objectives. Humans fight to send a message. The message is simple, and it has never changed. If you touch our people, we will find you, and we will make certain that you never have the capacity to touch them again. I pulled up a secondary file, one I had obtained from a retired Diraxi intelligence analyst who had spent a decade studying human military training programs. The findings had disturbed him so deeply that he had shared the file with me as a warning, not as a favor. There is another element that most species overlook when assessing human military strength, I said. It is not their technology, which is competent, but not exceptional. It is not their numbers, which are misleading but ultimately finite. It is their training philosophy. Every other species in this galaxy trains its military personnel to follow orders, execute doctrine, and operate within the framework of a command structure. Humans do all of these things, but they add something else. They train their officers to think independently, to make decisions without authorization when communication with command is lost, to adapt in real time to situations that were not covered by any briefing or any plan. I thought of the 4 frigate captains at Prospect 7. No one had ordered them to hold that position for 9 hours. No one had given them permission to engage a force 30 times their size. They had looked at the situation, understood what was at stake, and made their own decision. And their decision had been the same one that any human would have made. Stand and fight. Protect the people behind you. Hold the line until help arrives, and if help does not arrive, hold it anyway. That kind of individual initiative was something that most galactic military academies actively discouraged, because it introduced unpredictability into the chain of command. Humans embraced it. They built their entire command philosophy around the assumption that their officers would need to operate alone, cut off, outgunned, and without support. And they trained them to succeed in exactly those conditions. What this means in practice, I continued, is that you cannot defeat a human force simply by destroying its command structure. Every other species in this galaxy, if you remove their admirals and their communication network, the fleet falls apart. Individual captains wait for orders that never come, and the formation dissolves. Human captains do not wait. They assess, they decide, and they act. You could destroy every flagship in a human fleet, and the remaining ships would continue fighting, because every single captain on every single vessel has been trained to operate as though they are the last ship standing, and the fight still matters. I opened the next file, a tactical analysis of human ship design that had been compiled by a Council intelligence team after the Scythian incident. The report was clinical in its language, but staggering in its conclusions. Human warships were not beautiful. They were not elegant or streamlined or designed with any apparent concern for aesthetics. They were blocky, angular, and covered in what the report described as redundant armor plating of excessive thickness. Every critical system on a human warship had at least one backup, and most had 2. Their weapon systems were designed to continue functioning even after the ship had sustained what any other species would consider fatal damage. The report included a note from the technical assessment team that read, "Human vessel design philosophy appears to be based on the assumption that every component will fail during combat, and the ship must remain operational regardless." No other species builds ships this way, I said. It is enormously expensive. It makes their vessels heavier, slower, and more resource-intensive to produce. But it also means that a human warship that has taken enough damage to destroy any comparable vessel in the galaxy can still fight, can still maneuver, can still shoot back. They build their ships the way they have always built everything, with the stubborn, infuriating expectation that things will go wrong, and the absolute refusal to accept that going wrong means giving up. There was one more entry in the report that I read aloud, because I wanted the words to exist outside my own head, where they might feel less like a prophecy. The intelligence team noted an additional observation regarding human combat behavior. In simulated engagements, and in the limited real-world data available from the Scythian incident, Human vessels consistently engaged at ranges that other species would consider dangerously close. The standard engagement distance for most galactic navies is between 40 and 60,000 kilometers, which allows for sensor accuracy while minimizing exposure to short-range weapons. Human vessels routinely close to under 15,000 kilometers before opening fire. When asked about this tendency, a human tactical instructor reportedly explained that at close range, you can see what you are shooting at, and you do not miss. I paused on that. Close-range engagement was considered reckless by every military academy in the galaxy. It exposed your own ships to the same concentrated fire you were delivering. The casualty rates in close-range engagements were dramatically higher for both sides. No rational species would choose to fight that way. But humans did not measure rationality the way other species did. For them, the calculus was different. A fight at long range might be safer for your own ships, but it was also slower, less decisive, and gave the enemy more time to maneuver and escape. A fight at close range was dangerous, but it was fast, it was decisive, and it ensured that the enemy could not slip away. Humans would rather take damage and win quickly than stay safe and risk a prolonged engagement. It was a philosophy rooted in something deeper than tactics. It was rooted in their fundamental impatience with half measures and their absolute commitment to finishing what they started. I closed the file and sat in silence for a long moment, watching the glow of the console reflect off the walls of my quarters. Then I opened a new communication window and composed a private, encrypted message to Commander Dorath. I did not try to be diplomatic. I did not try to be polite. I simply wrote one sentence. I am begging you to reconsider. The response came within minutes. Your concern is noted and dismissed. I stared at those 5 words and felt something I had not felt in 23 years of diplomatic service. Helplessness so complete that it bordered on grief. Because I knew what was coming. I could see it as clearly as if it had already happened, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I closed the message, poured myself a glass of the strong amber drink that the Doraxi ambassador had given me as a diplomatic courtesy, and opened my personal log one final time for the night. The dead do not read warnings, I said quietly. They just become warnings for everyone else. I drank. The liquid burned, and somewhere, far away across the dark expanse of space, 800 Vraxian warships were already moving toward the one place in this galaxy they should never have gone. 13 days after the Vraxian fleet departed from their staging grounds, the Council's long-range sensor network registered the first signs of contact. I was in the observation gallery when the data feeds began streaming in, surrounded by a dozen other ambassadors who had come to watch the campaign unfold on the strategic display. The gallery was high above the main council chamber, a curved room with floor-to-ceiling screens that could display real-time tactical data from any monitored sector of the galaxy. It was designed for moments like this, moments when the council needed to watch history happen. The mood in the gallery was tense, but not alarmed. Most of the ambassadors expected this to be a routine observation. The Vraxians had the numbers, the firepower, and the strategic initiative. Commander Dorath had been broadcasting progress reports to the Council throughout the journey, each one more confident than the last. The fleet was on schedule. Morale was high. The approach vector had been calculated to bring the fleet into the human system from a direction that minimized exposure to potential defensive positions. Everything was proceeding according to plan. I stood at the back of the gallery, with my arms folded across my chest, and watched the display with the quiet dread of someone who has already seen the ending of this particular story. The first thing the Vraxians encountered when they entered human-controlled space was nothing. Absolutely nothing. The outer monitoring stations that humans maintained at the edges of their territory were dark and cold. The small patrol vessels that occasionally swept through the border regions were gone. The communication beacons that humans used to mark their territorial boundaries were still transmitting, but there was no response when the Vraxian fleet broadcast its presence. Commander Dorath, predictably, interpreted this as confirmation of his thesis. He sent a message to the Council that I watched play across the gallery screens in real time. Human border defenses have been abandoned. No resistance encountered. The enemy appears to have retreated to their inner system. This is consistent with our assessment of their limited military capability. Several ambassadors in the gallery nodded. One of them, a young Kaleshi delegate whose species had joined the council only 3 decades ago, turned to me and said, "It appears your concerns were unfounded, Ambassador Thanos." I did not look at him. I kept my eyes on the tactical display, watching the formation of 800 Vraxian warships moving deeper into human space, and I said, "They are not retreating. They are letting you in." The Kaleshi delegate frowned. "Letting us in? Why would they do that?" "Because human military doctrine is not built around defending borders," I said. "It is built around choosing the ground where you fight. They do not meet you at the door. They let you walk through the house. They let you feel comfortable. They let you spread out, extend your supply lines, and commit to a position, and then they close the door behind you." He stared at me, as though I had said something deeply irrational, and then he turned back to the display. I did not blame him. It sounded irrational. Every species in the galaxy built its military strategy around border defense. You fortified your perimeter, you intercepted threats as far from your core systems as possible, and you used the advantage of defensive positioning to compensate for any numerical disadvantage. It was logical. It was efficient. It was what everyone did. Except humans. The Vraxian fleet continued its advance for 2 more days without encountering any resistance. They passed through 3 human-claimed systems, each one empty and silent. Dorath's reports grew more boastful. He began using phrases like strategic collapse and complete defensive failure. He requested that the Council begin drafting preliminary terms for the formal annexation of human territory. Speaker Morath, to his credit, declined to do so. On the 15th day after departure, the Vraxian fleet reached the outer boundary of humanity's home system, what humans called the Oort perimeter, a vast shell of ice and rock that surrounded their solar system at an enormous distance. It was here, in the cold dark at the edge of human space, that the war actually began. I was standing in the gallery when the first data spike appeared on the tactical display. The Kaleshi delegate was reviewing trade reports on his personal console. The Phelan ambassador, a tall and thin figure named Kellis, was engaged in a low conversation with his aide near the window. No one was paying close attention to the display anymore. The approach had been so uneventful that most of the gallery had mentally filed the campaign under routine. Then the display lit up. The first wave of contacts appeared as a cascade of red markers, dozens of them, blooming across the tactical feed like drops of blood hitting water. The Vraxian fleet's formation, which had been a neat, organized grid of blue markers, suddenly fractured. Ships were falling out of formation, emergency beacons were activating, communication channels were flooding with overlapping distress calls. "What is happening?" the Kaleshi delegate said, rising from his seat. I watched the display and felt my stomach tighten. "Mines," I said. Not conventional mines, not the kind of static explosive devices that most species scattered around strategic choke points. These were something else entirely. Autonomous weapons platforms, self-guided, independently powered, and equipped with targeting systems that could distinguish between allied and enemy vessels. Humans had seeded them throughout the Oort perimeter years ago, perhaps decades ago, and they had simply never told anyone about them. They had floated in the dark, dormant and patient, waiting for exactly this moment. The Vraxian fleet lost 60 ships in the first 90 seconds. The gallery erupted. Ambassadors were on their feet, shouting questions, demanding updated data feeds. The tactical display was struggling to keep up with the volume of new contacts and status changes. Blue markers were disappearing, replaced by the gray indicators that meant a ship had been destroyed or disabled. The neat formation of the Vraxian fleet was already unrecognizable, scattered and broken by the initial shock of an attack that no one had anticipated. But the mines were not the worst part. 30 seconds after the minefield activated, a second wave of contacts appeared on the tactical display. These were not autonomous platforms. These were ships, human ships, and they were not coming from the direction of Earth. They came from behind the Vraxian fleet, and below it, and above it. 47 human warships, running dark, engines cold, drifting in the void with no power signatures, no heat emissions, no electromagnetic output of any kind. They had been there the entire time, sitting in the dark, waiting, watching the Vraxian fleet pass by them like a predator lying motionless in tall grass, while its prey walks directly overhead. And now they were awake. The first human strike group hit the Vraxian rear guard before the Vraxians even knew they were there. The tactical display showed the engagement as a sudden, violent compression of markers, blue and green tangling together in a tight cluster of activity. The Vraxian rear guard, which consisted of supply ships and support vessels, was not designed to withstand a direct assault. It folded in minutes. They were behind them, Ambassador Kellis whispered. He had come to stand beside me, his thin frame rigid with shock. The humans were behind them the entire time. They were everywhere, I said. They have been preparing for this since the moment they learned the Vraxians were coming. Probably longer. The minefield was not planted in the last 2 weeks. It has been there for years. The strike groups were positioned along the approach vector before the Vraxian fleet even left its staging grounds. Everything you are watching right now was planned before the first Vraxian ship powered up its engines. Kellis looked at me with wide, pale eyes. How is that possible? How could they have known the exact approach vector? Because humans do not guess, I said. They calculate. They model. They run scenarios and prepare for all of them. The approach vector that the Vraxians chose was the most logical one, based on the position of their staging grounds relative to the human system. The humans knew the Vraxians would choose it because it was the obvious choice. So they prepared for it, and they probably prepared for the 6 other possible approach vectors as well, just in case. On the display, the battle was evolving with a speed and precision that was difficult to follow. The initial ambush from the rear had thrown the Vraxian fleet into disorder, but Vraxian commanders were experienced and well-trained. They were already attempting to regroup, pulling their scattered formations back together and turning to face the threat behind them. Under normal circumstances, this would have been the correct response. But the humans were not finished. As the Vraxian fleet rotated to engage the strike group at their rear, a second human force appeared on the display. This one came from the direction of the inner system, from the direction of Earth itself. 80 ships, moving fast, hitting the Vraxian forward elements while they were turned away, focused on the threat behind them. The Vraxians were caught between 2 forces. In 3-dimensional space, with ships scattered and disorganized from the minefield and the initial ambush, they were being split apart. The humans were not trying to fight the entire Vraxian fleet at once. They were cutting it into pieces, isolating smaller groups of Vraxian ships and engaging them with local superiority while the rest of the fleet struggled to coordinate. I recognized the pattern from my studies. Humans had a term for it, a concept they had developed centuries ago on their own world, long before they ever reached the stars. They called it defeat in detail. The principle was simple. You never fight a large enemy force as a whole. You break it apart and you fight the pieces one at a time, ensuring that at every point of contact you have the advantage. It required extraordinary coordination, precise timing, and a willingness to accept risk at every stage of the operation, because while you were engaging one piece, the rest of the enemy fleet could theoretically regroup and overwhelm you. No other species in the galaxy practiced this doctrine, because no other species had the communication discipline, the tactical flexibility, or the sheer audacity to attempt it in 3-dimensional space. Humans did it as though it were second nature. "This is a slaughter," Kellis said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "No," I said. "This is a lesson." The battle continued for hours. I did not leave the gallery. I could not. I stood at the railing and watched the tactical display with the grim fascination of someone observing a force of nature, something beyond persuasion or negotiation, something that simply was. The tactical display cycled through data feeds as the Council's sensor network struggled to process the volume of information. Around me, the gallery had become a theater of reactions. The Morvathi military advisor was speaking rapidly into a recording device, narrating every tactical shift for his government's war college. The Drexy trade representative had stopped calculating economic opportunities and was sitting very still, his face drained of color. 2 Kaleshi diplomats were engaged in a heated whispered argument about whether their own fleet was capable of defending against the tactics they were watching. The answer, based on what was happening on the screen, was clearly no. What struck me most was the coordination. I had read about human tactical discipline in classified reports, but reading about it and watching it in real time were entirely different experiences. The human ships were not simply fighting as individual vessels. They were functioning as a single organism, each ship aware of its position relative to every other ship, each engagement timed and coordinated with a precision that suggested either extraordinary communication systems or the kind of deep, instinctive teamwork that only comes from years of training together. Vraxian ships that attempted to break through the human formations found themselves being herded, guided by subtle shifts in the human positioning into zones where concentrated fire from multiple angles would greet them. It was like watching a pack of predators working together, each one knowing exactly where the others would be, without needing to check. Vraxian ships were being destroyed or disabled at a rate that made the gallery screens look like a cascade of falling markers. Blue icons flickered to gray, one after another, in a relentless, methodical rhythm that spoke not of chaos, but of calculation. The humans were not fighting with desperation. They were fighting with the cold, efficient precision of a species that had planned every phase of this engagement in advance and was now simply executing. Commander Dorath's face appeared on the diplomatic channel. I barely recognized him. The rigid confidence was gone. The measured precision was gone. He looked like a man who had just watched the floor disappear beneath his feet and was still falling. This is Commander Dorath, of the Vraxian Dominion, addressing the Galactic Council. We are requesting emergency military assistance. The human forces have engaged our fleet with weapons and tactics that were not anticipated by our strategic assessment. We are sustaining significant losses and require immediate reinforcement. The gallery went silent. Every ambassador in the room looked at each other, and in that shared glance, I saw the answer before anyone spoke it. No one was going to help. No one was going to send their ships into the middle of what was happening on that display. The Vraxians had 800 warships, and the humans were taking them apart with surgical efficiency. No sane government would insert their own forces into that environment. Speaker Morath called an emergency vote. The question was simple. Would the Council authorize a military intervention in support of the Vraxian campaign? The vote was unanimous. No, 400 species, and not a single one was willing to risk their own people to save the Vraxians from the consequences of their own decision. The Kaleshi delegate, who had told me my concerns were unfounded just days earlier, did not meet my eyes as his delegation cast their vote. The Drexy representative, who had been calculating annexation profits before the battle began, voted no without hesitation. Even the species that had been most sympathetic to the Vraxian position, the ones who had nodded along during Dorath's speech in the council chamber, turned their backs with the speed of creatures who understood that standing too close to a falling structure was a good way to be buried in the debris. Dorath's face was still on the screen when the vote was announced. I watched his expression change as the numbers came in. I watched the precise moment when he understood that he was alone, that the 800 ships he had led into human space were the only ships he would ever have, and they were disappearing from his command board one by one, like candles being blown out in a dark room. He looked directly at the camera, and for one brief moment, his eyes found mine in the gallery. I do not know if he could actually see me through the feed, but it felt as though he could. It felt as though he was looking at the one person who had tried to warn him and wondering why he had not listened. I held his gaze. I did not flinch. I did not look away. And then the feed cut out, and Commander Dorath was gone, and the tactical display continued its silent, methodical accounting of destruction. By the time the engagement ended, the Vraxian fleet of 800 warships had been reduced to 214 functional vessels. The rest were debris. The humans had lost 31 ships, 31 against nearly 600. It was not a battle. It was a demonstration. The gallery emptied slowly, as if the ambassadors could not quite believe it was over, and were afraid to leave, in case they missed a final twist. I heard fragments of conversation as they filed past me. The Torelli ambassador was telling her aide that she intended to propose an immediate increase in her species' diplomatic staff assigned to Earth. The Morvathi military advisor was speaking into his communicator in a low, urgent voice, recommending a complete restructuring of his own government's defensive doctrine based on what he had just witnessed. One of the Kaleshi delegates passed me without a word, his face the color of old ash. I stood in the gallery long after the others had left, watching the display as the surviving Vraxian ships began their retreat, limping back toward their own space with damaged engines and shattered formations. The human fleet did not pursue them immediately. For a few hours, the display showed the human ships holding position, regrouping, taking stock of their own losses. I allowed myself a single, foolish moment of hope that perhaps this was where it would end. Perhaps the humans would be satisfied with the devastation they had already inflicted. Perhaps they would secure their system, count their dead, and begin the slow process of returning to the quiet, unassuming posture that had made the galaxy underestimate them in the first place. And then, slowly, methodically, the green markers on the display began to move, not back toward Earth, not toward their own defensive positions. They moved in the same direction the Vraxian survivors were heading. The humans were following. The battle was over, but the war was not. That was the part I had been most afraid of, and watching it unfold on the tactical display from the gallery of the council station, I felt the kind of dread that does not spike and fade, but settles into your bones and stays there, quiet and heavy, like the weight of something you cannot lift and cannot put down. The surviving Vraxian ships, 214 vessels in various states of damage, were retreating toward their own space, as fast as their wounded engines could carry them. Their formation was ragged, their communication channels were flooded with damage reports and casualty counts, and their morale was visibly shattered. Every sensor reading the Council's network picked up painted the same picture. A fleet that had entered human space as a conquering force was now running for its life. And behind them, at a distance that was close enough to track, but far enough to avoid immediate engagement, the human fleet was following. I stood at the railing of the observation gallery, my hands gripping the cold metal, and I watched the green markers on the tactical display maintain their steady, patient pursuit. They were not rushing. They were not closing the gap. They were simply following, matching the Vraxian speed exactly, staying just at the edge of weapons range, a constant presence on every Vraxian sensor screen. Ambassador Kellis appeared beside me. His thin frame was hunched, and his normally composed features were drawn tight with anxiety. "Why are they not attacking?" he asked. "They could close the distance and finish the engagement. They have the tactical advantage. Why are they just following?" "Because this is not about tactical advantage anymore," I said. "This is about psychology. Every Vraxian captain on that retreat is looking at their sensors right now and seeing a human fleet behind them that will not go away. They cannot outrun it, they cannot hide from it, and every hour that passes, the pressure builds, the exhaustion builds, the fear builds. By the time the humans choose to engage again, the Vraxians will be so worn down psychologically that the fight will be half over before the first shot is fired." Kellis stared at the display. "That is monstrous." "That is humanity," I said. "They do not fight the way we fight, Ambassador. They do not stop when the strategic objective is achieved. When someone attacks their home, their people, their territory, they pursue. They call it forward defense, but every analyst in the galaxy knows what it really is. It is a response designed to ensure that the aggressor, and every other civilization watching, understands the cost of the decision that was made. Humanity does not just defeat its enemies, it makes examples of them." The gallery had filled again, as word spread through the council station. Ambassadors who had gone to their quarters after the initial battle were returning, drawn by the feeds showing the ongoing pursuit. The mood was no longer tense with anticipation. It was heavy with the particular kind of silence that descends when intelligent beings realize they are watching something historic and terrible. On the second day of the pursuit, Commander Lena Voss appeared on the Council's primary communication channel. Every screen in the gallery switched to her feed simultaneously. She was seated in what appeared to be a command center, surrounded by displays and officers, but she herself was perfectly still. Her expression was calm, her hands folded on the table before her, her voice steady and clear. "This is Commander Lena Voss, speaking on behalf of the United Earth Defense Authority. This message is directed to the Galactic Governing Council and to all member species currently monitoring this channel." The gallery went completely silent. 11 days before the Vraxian fleet departed their staging grounds, the intelligence services of the United Earth Defense Authority intercepted and decrypted the complete operational planning for the campaign, designated by Vraxian Command, as Operation Swift Horizon. We were aware of the fleet composition, the approach vector, the timeline, and the strategic objectives. We chose not to raise a diplomatic objection because doing so would have compromised intelligence sources that we consider vital to our long-term security. She paused, and in that pause, I saw several ambassadors in the gallery shift uncomfortably. The implication was clear. If humans could intercept and decrypt Vraxian military communications, they could probably do the same to anyone else in the galaxy. The Earth Defense Authority considers the Vraxian attack an act of unprovoked military aggression against a sovereign world and its people. In accordance with our standing defense doctrine, we have authorized a full military response. This response will proceed in the following manner. Another pause. Absolute stillness in the gallery. All surviving Vraxian military vessels will be pursued to their point of origin. Upon arrival in Vraxian space, the Earth Defense Authority will engage and neutralize all Vraxian military shipyards, orbital weapons platforms, and fleet staging facilities. We will additionally neutralize all active Vraxian warships that have not surrendered. The Earth Defense Authority has no interest in occupying Vraxian territory, governing Vraxian populations, or interfering in Vraxian civil affairs. Our objective is limited and specific: the complete and permanent removal of the Vraxian Dominion's capacity to project military force. She said it the way someone would announce a change in shipping schedules. Calm, professional, matter-of-fact. As though the systematic dismantling of a galactic military power was simply a task on a list that needed to be completed. The Earth Defense Authority wishes to assure all Council member species that this action is directed solely at the Vraxian military and does not represent a broader shift in human strategic posture. We remain committed to peaceful relations with all species that maintain peaceful relations with us. This concludes our statement. The screen went dark. For several seconds, nobody in the gallery spoke. Then the chaos began. The Dramari ambassador was the first to move. He practically ran to his communication console and began dictating an urgent message to his homeworld. Within minutes, 3 other species followed. I learned later that within the first hour after Commander Voss's broadcast, 12 species had filed formal requests to reaffirm their non-aggression treaties with Earth. 6 others had begun drafting official letters of support for the human position, distancing themselves from the Vraxian campaign as aggressively as diplomatic language would allow. 2 species whose governments had made mildly critical public comments about humanity in the past 5 years issued formal apologies, unprompted, for statements that most people had already forgotten. Ambassador Kellis, whose species, the Phelan, had once publicly mocked human physical endurance at a galactic summit, quietly excused himself from the gallery. He did not return for the remainder of the crisis. I later heard from his aide that Kellis spent the following week personally reviewing every public statement the Phelan government had ever made regarding humanity, searching for anything that could be interpreted as hostile or dismissive. He found 17 such statements. His government retracted all of them within the month. The Veshan ambassador, a normally composed individual, approached me during a brief recess and asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, whether I believed the humans would stop at the Vraxian border. Would they continue? Would they look for other offenses, other species who had slighted them, other targets? I told him that based on everything I knew about human military behavior, they would do exactly what Commander Voss had said, and nothing more. Humans were precise in their responses. They did not engage in wars of expansion or opportunistic conquest. They responded to specific threats with specific actions, and when the action was complete, they went home. The Veshan ambassador did not look entirely convinced, but he thanked me and returned to his console with the careful movements of a man walking across thin ice. I watched all of this with the exhaustion of a man who had shouted a warning into a storm and been ignored, and was now watching the flood he had predicted sweep through the valley below. On the 4th day of the pursuit, Commander Dorath appeared in the gallery. Not on a screen, in person. He had taken a shuttle from a Vraxian diplomatic vessel that was still docked at the council station, and he had come to find me. I was standing at my usual position at the back of the gallery when I heard his footsteps. I turned and saw him approaching, and I barely recognized the man. The rigid confidence was gone. The broad shoulders were hunched. His gray skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality, that I associated with extreme stress in Vraxian physiology. He looked like someone who had aged 10 years in 4 days. "Ambassador Thanos," he said. His voice was rough, stripped of its former authority. "Commander Dorath, you tried to warn me." "Yes. I should have listened." "Yes." He stood in silence for a moment, and then he asked the question that I had been dreading since the pursuit began. "Can you broker a ceasefire? You have a relationship with the human delegation. You spoke in our defense. Can you help us?" I looked at him, and I felt something complicated, a mixture of pity and frustration, and sorrow that I could not fully separate into its component parts. He was asking me to help, and I wanted to help, because preventing further destruction was supposed to be the entire purpose of my profession. But I knew something about human military doctrine that Dorath did not, something that would determine whether a ceasefire was even possible. "Commander," I said slowly, "I need to ask you a question, and I need you to answer it honestly." "Ask." "During the initial approach, before the engagement at the Ort perimeter, your fleet passed through 3 human-claimed systems. Those systems contained civilian infrastructure, monitoring stations, communication relays, a research outpost in the second system." I paused. "Did any of your ships fire on civilian structures?" Dorath was silent. The silence lasted too long. Far too long. "Commander," I said again, "did your ships fire on civilian targets?" "The research outpost," he said quietly. "It was broadcasting an active sensor sweep of our fleet. Our tactical commander considered it a potential threat and authorized a strike. The outpost was destroyed. There were 37 personnel aboard." I closed my eyes. 37 people. Scientists, researchers, civilians. Dead. "Then no," I said. "I cannot help you." Dorath stared at me. "Why? Because of 37 people?" "Because of what those 37 people mean to the humans who are following your fleet right now," I said. "If this had been a purely military engagement, ship against ship, fleet against fleet, there might have been room for negotiation. Humans understand military conflict. They respect it, in their own way. But you destroyed a civilian facility. You took 37 lives that had nothing to do with the war you started. And in human military culture, that changes everything. That transforms this from a strategic response into something personal, something emotional. And when humans fight from emotion, Commander, they do not stop." Dorath's face crumbled. It was not dramatic, it was not loud. It was simply the quiet collapse of a man who realized that the mistake he had made was not tactical, but existential, and that there was no path back from where he stood. "Then what happens now?" he asked. "Now," I said, "the humans come to your home. And they do exactly what Commander Voss said they would do. They take apart every shipyard, every weapons platform, every military installation your Dominion possesses. And when they are done, you will still have your world, your people, your cities, your culture. But you will never threaten anyone again. That is the human way. They do not want to rule you. They just want to make sure you can never do what you did ever again." Dorath left the gallery without another word. I watched him go, and I felt the weight of everything I had failed to prevent press down on me until I could barely breathe. His question echoed in my mind long after he was gone. Because of 37 people. He had said it as though it were a small number, as though 37 lives were a rounding error in the mathematics of war, and by the cold calculus of galactic military history, perhaps they were. Battles between fleet-scale forces routinely produced casualties in the thousands. 37 was a footnote, a statistical insignificance. But humans did not think in statistics, they thought in names. Somewhere in the records of the Earth Defense Authority, those 37 people were not a number, they were individuals. They had names and families and unfinished projects and messages they had sent to loved ones the morning before the Vraxian strike reduced their outpost to debris. And every single human on every single ship in that pursuing fleet knew those names, because that was what humans did. They learned the names. They carried them, and they made sure that the people who had taken those names from the universe understood exactly what they had done. In the gallery behind me, the tactical display continued to track the pursuit. The human fleet had been reinforced. Fresh ships were arriving from Earth, and from positions I had not known about, joining the pursuit force as it crossed into the space between human and Vraxian territory. The original strike groups that had fought at the Orc perimeter were being rotated to the rear, replaced by fresh crews and undamaged vessels. The humans were cycling their forces, keeping the pursuit at full strength, while allowing their tired crews to rest. It was the kind of logistical discipline that most species could not maintain for a few days. The humans had been doing it for weeks, and they showed no signs of stopping. I opened my personal log and recorded what I knew would be one of the final entries of this crisis. The galaxy keeps making the same mistake. They look at humanity and they see a species with short lives, soft bodies, and a small corner of one unremarkable solar system. They see a species that trades fairly, that sends medical ships to disaster zones, that laughs easily and forgives small offenses. And because humans are kind, the galaxy assumes they are safe. But kindness and safety are not the same thing. A human will share their last meal with a stranger. But if you threaten what they love, if you touch the people they have sworn to protect, they will dismantle everything you have built, and they will do it with the same calm efficiency that they bring to everything else. Not because they enjoy destruction, but because they believe, with a conviction so deep it might as well be written into their genetic code, that the only way to protect what matters is to make sure that no one ever dares to threaten it again. I paused the recording. On the display behind me, the green markers of the human fleet continued their steady, patient pursuit toward Vraxian space. They had not slowed, they had not deviated, they were coming, and there was nothing in this galaxy that was going to stop them. 6 weeks after the Vraxian fleet had departed on its doomed campaign, I stood in the observation gallery of the Council Station and watched the live tactical feed from Vraxian space. The human fleet had arrived at the outer defense ring of the Vraxian homeworld, and the display showed a sight that I suspected would haunt the dreams of every strategist and diplomat in the galaxy for generations to come. Over 3,000 human vessels. 3,000. Arrayed in a formation that encompassed the entire approach corridor to the Vraxian home system, a wall of ships so dense that the tactical display could barely render them as individual markers. Some of these ships I recognized from the fleet registries, the standard warships of the Earth Defense Authority, blocky and armored and bristling with weapons. But many of them were not in any registry I had ever seen. They carried no identification transponders. Their hull configurations did not match any known human vessel class. According to every official record in the galaxy, these ships did not exist. And yet there they were, 3,000 strong, patient, silent, waiting. The gallery was packed. Every ambassador on the council station was present, along with their aides, their military advisors, and in several cases, their heads of state, who had traveled to the station specifically to witness what everyone understood was a pivotal moment in galactic history. The atmosphere was thick with tension, but beneath the tension, there was something else, something quieter, something that felt like reverence. The Vraxian government surrendered before a single shot was fired. The surrender came as a broadcast on all channels, transmitted from the Vraxian capital on their homeworld. The speaker was not Commander Dorath. It was the Vraxian High Minister, the civilian leader of the Dominion, a woman named Presiding Minister Cathara. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. I could see them trembling on the edge of the podium as she spoke. The Vraxian Dominion acknowledges the military action taken against the sovereign world of Earth as an unprovoked act of aggression. The Vraxian Dominion accepts full responsibility for this action and its consequences. The Vraxian Dominion hereby offers its unconditional surrender to the United Earth Defense Authority and requests the cessation of all military operations in Vraxian space. Unconditional surrender. The words hung in the air of the gallery like smoke. I heard someone behind me exhale sharply, and I realized that dozens of ambassadors had been holding their breath. The human response came within the hour. Commander Voss appeared on the diplomatic channel once more, her expression as composed as it had been in every previous communication. Behind her, I could see the bustling activity of a command center operating at full capacity, but Voss herself projected an almost unsettling calm. The United Earth Defense Authority acknowledges the Vraxian Dominion's surrender and accepts the terms of unconditional capitulation. The following conditions will be implemented immediately and without modification. She spoke for 12 minutes. I recorded every word. The terms were comprehensive: complete and permanent disarmament of all Vraxian military forces. The dismantling of every shipyard, weapons manufacturing facility, and military research installation within Vraxian space. Full financial reparations to every human family that had lost a member as a result of the Vraxian campaign, with the specific amounts to be determined by an independent audit of Vraxian economic capacity. And one final condition that made the council gallery go so quiet, I could hear the hum of the station's environmental systems. All Vraxian military personnel who held command authority during the campaign against Earth, including, but not limited to, fleet commanders, tactical officers, and the individuals who authorized the targeting of civilian installations, will be remanded to human custody. They will stand trial in a human court of law, under human legal jurisdiction, for the destruction of the research outpost in the Karath system and the deaths of the 37 civilians stationed there. The trials will be open to galactic observation. The proceedings will be conducted in accordance with the legal standards of the United Earth Defense Authority, which include the right to legal representation, the presumption of innocence, and the right of appeal. The gallery erupted, not in protest, but in a dozen overlapping conversations as ambassadors processed what they had just heard. Trying human military leaders in a human court was unprecedented. The Galactic Council had its own tribunal system for exactly these situations. But Commander Voss had not asked for the Council's tribunal. She had not even acknowledged its existence. She had simply stated that the trials would happen in human courts, under human law, as though the galactic legal framework were irrelevant. And nobody objected, nobody raised a formal protest, nobody invoked the Council's judicial authority, because every single ambassador in that gallery understood, with perfect clarity, that the humans were not asking for permission. They were informing the galaxy of what was going to happen. And given that 3,000 human warships were currently parked in orbit around the Vraxian homeworld, objecting seemed unwise. In the days that followed, the political landscape of the galaxy shifted, with a speed that I had never seen in my 23 years of diplomatic service. The Vraxian Dominion, which had been the fourth largest military power in the sector, was effectively disarmed overnight. Their shipyards went dark. Their weapons platforms were dismantled, piece by piece, under the supervision of human engineering teams. Their fleet, what remained of it, was decommissioned and scrapped. In the space of a few weeks, a civilization that had projected power across multiple systems was reduced to a purely civilian society, dependent on trade agreements and diplomatic goodwill for its security. The trials began 3 months later, and I attended every session. The Vraxian military commanders were brought to Earth, to a courtroom in a coastal city called The Hague, which humans had apparently designated centuries ago as a center for international justice. The proceedings were broadcast on every council channel, and I watched the gallery fill with representatives from dozens of species who had come to observe not just the trial itself, but the manner in which humanity conducted it. What struck me was the fairness. The Vraxian commanders were provided with legal representation, human lawyers who argued their case with what appeared to be genuine dedication. The evidence was presented methodically, challenged by the defense, and evaluated by a panel of judges whose impartiality was beyond question. The families of the 37 civilians who had perished at the research outpost sat in the gallery, and they were permitted to speak, to describe who they had lost and what those losses meant. There was grief in that courtroom. There was anger, but there was also a structure that contained those emotions within the bounds of law and process. The Vraxians were not dragged to summary judgment. They were given every opportunity to explain their actions, to present mitigating circumstances, to appeal to the court's understanding. And then they were convicted, because the facts were clear, and the law was clear, and the court applied both, without sentiment or vengeance. The sentences were long but not extreme. Imprisonment, not execution. Humanity had abolished the death penalty for war crimes decades ago, a fact that surprised many species in the gallery. They had expected severity. What they got was justice, measured, thorough, and anchored in principles that predated humanity's entry into galactic society by centuries. But the dismantling of the Vraxian military was only the most visible consequence. The invisible consequences were far more significant. 12 species filed formal requests to establish deeper diplomatic ties with Earth. These were not symbolic gestures. They were concrete proposals for trade agreements, cultural exchanges, scientific partnerships, and mutual defense pacts. Species that had kept humanity at arm's length for decades were suddenly eager to be seen as friends of Earth. 6 species voluntarily reduced their own military spending, not because the humans asked them to, not because the Council mandated it, but because their governments had looked at what had happened to the Vraxians and decided that the safest possible signal to send to humanity was one of absolute non-threat. If you had no weapons, you could not be perceived as a danger, and if you were not perceived as a danger, the humans would leave you alone. The Council passed a unanimous resolution, the first unanimous resolution in 80 years, formally classifying Earth as a protected sovereign world. The designation meant that any attack on Earth would be considered an attack on the Council itself, triggering a collective defense response from all member species. I listened to the debate on the resolution and almost smiled at the carefully worded language that attempted to frame the designation as a generous act of galactic solidarity. Everyone in the gallery knew the truth. The resolution was not for Earth's benefit. Earth did not need the Council's protection. The resolution existed to give every other species in the galaxy an official, legal excuse to never, under any circumstances, be drawn into a conflict with humanity. I attended the formal signing ceremony for the resolution. Speaker Morath presided, his ancient features betraying nothing as he read the text aloud. Commander Voss was present, representing Earth, and she signed the document with a simple, clean signature and a nod of acknowledgement. She did not smile, she did not celebrate. She treated it the way she treated everything, with the calm, professional efficiency of someone who had expected this outcome all along. After the ceremony, I found myself standing alone in the corridor outside the council chamber. The other ambassadors had gone to a reception. I did not feel like celebrating. I felt like someone who had survived a disaster that he had predicted and been powerless to prevent. Commander Voss appeared beside me. I had not heard her approach, which was unusual. Humans were not a particularly stealthy species, and the corridor was quiet. But she had a way of moving through spaces as though she belonged in them, as though her presence was as natural and unremarkable as the air. "Ambassador Thanos," she said. "Commander Voss, you were the only one who tried to stop it." I shrugged, a gesture I had picked up from humans during my time on Earth. "I failed." "You did not fail. You told the truth. The Vraxians chose not to listen. That is a different thing." We stood in silence for a moment, and then she said something that I did not expect. "We would like to offer you a formal appointment, an ambassadorial position, not from the Council, but from Earth. We want you to serve as our primary diplomatic liaison to the Council. You understand us, Ambassador. You have studied us. You see us clearly, which is more than most species can claim. And we need someone who sees us clearly, because the alternative is that they see us through fear alone, and fear without understanding is a dangerous foundation for interstellar relations." I considered the offer for a long time, not because I was uncertain about my answer, but because I wanted to understand the weight of it. The humans were asking me to stand between them and the rest of the galaxy, to be the voice that explained humanity to species who were now terrified of them, to be the bridge between kindness and consequence. "I will accept," I said, "on one condition." "Name it. Stop keeping secrets from me. I spent 6 years trying to get access to your military records. I know your fleet is larger than your official registry. I know about the autonomous weapons platforms. I know about the ships that do not exist in any database. If I am going to represent you to the galaxy, I need to understand the full scope of what I am representing." Voss looked at me for a long moment, and then she nodded. "Agreed. You will receive full clearance within the week." She extended her hand, the human gesture of agreement and trust, and I took it. Her grip was warm and firm, and in that moment, I understood something about humanity that all the classified files and tactical analyses had never quite captured. They were not a species defined by their capacity for destruction, though that capacity was real and enormous and terrifying. They were a species defined by their capacity for loyalty. They built relationships the way they built their ships, with redundancy, with resilience, with the assumption that things would go wrong and the absolute determination to hold together regardless. When they called you a friend, they meant it with a weight that most species could not fathom, and when someone threatened their friends, the same instinct that drove them to pursue the Scythian across 2 star systems, the same instinct that brought 3,000 ships to the Vraxian doorstep, would activate on your behalf. It was both the most comforting and the most frightening thing I had ever understood about another species. I walked back toward the gallery, and as I passed a window that looked out over the docking ring of the council station, I saw something that made me stop. A human cargo vessel was docked at one of the civilian berths, and a crew of humans was unloading crates marked with medical symbols. I checked the manifest later. The shipment was humanitarian aid, medical supplies and food stores, bound for the Vraxian homeworld. The same species that had just dismantled the Vraxian military was now sending medicine to the Vraxian people, not as a condition of surrender, not as a political gesture, but because there were Vraxian civilians who needed help, and humans could not look at suffering and do nothing about it. One of the crew members, a young man with broad shoulders and a quick smile, saw me watching through the window and waved. Just a casual, friendly wave, as though he were unloading supplies at a neighborhood market, rather than sending aid to a species his own people had just defeated in war. I waved back, because it seemed like the right thing to do, and because in that simple exchange, I understood something about humanity that no intelligence report could ever capture. That was the contradiction that made humanity so difficult for the galaxy to comprehend. They were a species that could park 3,000 warships over your world and dismantle your entire military infrastructure in a matter of weeks, and then turn around and send doctors to treat your sick and engineers to help rebuild your civilian power grid. They did not see any conflict between these two actions. To them, it was all part of the same principle. You protect the innocent. You hold accountable those who harm them. And when the accounting is done, you help pick up the pieces. Because the point was never to cause suffering. The point was to make sure that the conditions that led to the suffering could never happen again. I returned to my quarters that evening and opened my personal log for the final time. The crisis was over. The Vraxians had surrendered. The galaxy was rearranging itself around the new reality of human power, and I had been given a role that would define the rest of my career, and possibly the rest of my life. This is Ambassador Virel Thanis, I said. Personal log, final entry for the Vraxian crisis. The war is over. The Vraxian dominion has been disarmed. The Council has classified Earth as a protected sovereign world, and I have been offered a position as humanity's diplomatic liaison, which I have accepted. I paused, gathering my thoughts. The Council asked me to write a formal report on what happened, a comprehensive analysis of the conflict, its causes, its conduct, and its consequences. They want something detailed, something thorough, something that will serve as a reference for future diplomatic considerations involving humanity. Another pause. I told them I only needed one sentence. I leaned forward and spoke the words slowly and clearly, because I wanted them to be heard exactly as I meant them, without ambiguity, without softening, without the diplomatic cushioning that I had spent my entire career wrapping around difficult truths. They attacked Earth, and Earth remembered. I closed the log. Outside my window, the stars were quiet, and somewhere among them, humanity went about its business, trading, building, laughing, raising its children, tending its gardens, reaching out with open hands to every species willing to reach back. They were kind, they were generous, they were warm. They remembered the names of your family members and asked about them the next time they saw you. They sent flowers when someone was sick. They stayed up late to help a colleague finish a project that had no benefit to themselves. They loved deeply and grieved openly and forgave freely, and if you earned their trust, they would carry you through the darkest moments of your life without being asked. But they also remembered. They remembered every slight that mattered, every line that was crossed, every life that was taken without justification. They filed it away in that extraordinary human memory, the one that could hold a grudge for centuries and a friendship for just as long, and they waited. Not with malice, not with eagerness, just with the quiet, unwavering certainty that if the day came when those memories needed to become actions, they would be ready. They would always be ready. And they were watching, always watching, with the patient, steady gaze of a species that had learned, long ago, on a world full of predators and storms and shifting ground beneath their feet, that the price of safety was eternal vigilance, and the cost of mercy was the strength to enforce it. The galaxy would learn to live with that truth, because the alternative was to make the same mistake the Vraxians had made. And nobody, I was quite certain, would ever be that foolish again.